Dear friends and colleagues, it is a great honor to me to welcome you all to this first session of the seminar, Mitigating and Navigating Multiple Crises Between Adaptation and Mitigation. The seminar is being organized by CIVI, AGVA, and the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation. Today's session will be followed by two other sessions. The second one tomorrow on Thursday, and the third one on Friday. My name is Karin Lexén, and I'm the Secretary General of the Swedish Society of Nature Conservation, and I'm also an SPC. The objective of the seminar is to discuss and come forward with solutions on how sustainable management and governance of water resources can facilitate synergies between climate mitigation and adaptation. We will also showcase how this can help to avoid inefficiency and leverage responses to the multiple global crises the world is facing today. Implicit in this session is the objective that nature-based solutions can serve as a bridge between mitigation and adaptation. In the past, we have treated mitigation and adaptation as separate issues, assuming somehow that we always come together, always complement each other. Mitigation is ultimately, as we know, about slowing the rate of climate change by limiting our carbon emissions. And adaptation is about how we cope with the impact. Mitigation and adaptation should also contribute to eradicating poverty, even as we develop a stronger relationship with natural systems. In many cases, fossil-free energy and carbon sequestration programs have acted independently of adaptation, and we have not often looked for ways to reduce emissions in our adaptation work. Convergence between adaptation and mitigation requires, therefore, mindfulness of opportunities of both to support and reinforce each other. At this stage, we must radically slow down climate change at the same time as we respond to and prepare to its impact. The mere fact that this session and the entire World Water Week organized digitally and that we are not able to meet in person is one of the many consequences of the corona pandemic. However, it also demonstrates that it is possible to find solutions to manage a crisis. The pandemic has put the spotlight on our vulnerability and the need to build and preserve resilience. It has shown that it's possible to act forcefully and to take strong and difficult decisions. Further, it has become evident how dependent we are on each other and how closely we are connected. It is not possible to isolate one part of what happens in one corner, sooner or later affect human nature in another corner across the planet. At the twilight of the cascading and multiple crises we are facing, humanity must step up, mobilize available resources, and embrace solutions at hand. The release of the new IPCC report earlier this month makes the case very clear. Climate change is real and is already affecting the planet. If we don't act forcefully and in time, coming generations will be faced with an environmental crisis that threatens life as we know it today. It calls for bold and innovative solutions to climate crisis. Recent weather diseases, flooding, heat waves, and fires clearly showcase that the water climate crisis is also a crisis expressed with water. And that means that any solution must include water, grounded by the insight that the only way forward is healthy ecosystems working together with and not against nature. A vital component is finding and securing synergies between climate and adaptation. It is clear that we must manage multiple crises simultaneously. When acting on the corona crisis, we must at the same time steer toward a green and inclusive economy, leaving no one behind. Falling back in shortcut fossil solutions to kickstart the economy or static short-sighted adaptation will only delay the change we need and throw the burden on coming generations. The investments to rebuild the economy in the aftermath of the pandemic must contribute to long-term sustainability and resilient societies. And sustainable economies need to facilitate synergies between mitigation and adaptation. Sustainable management and governance of water resources provide elements that are important. For instance, agriculture, forest, and water management should contribute to climate change adaptation and risk management while reducing large emissions of greenhouse gases. Land use transformation, ecosystem restoration, green infrastructure can easily be adapted to a changing environment, and agile decision support tools need to be designed in ways that reduce climate impacts while contributing to increased resilience and adaptation to change. Good news is that a lot is happening and that there are innovative solutions at hand. So we must act on the acute threat of an accelerating climate change and biodiversity loss. In this, we shall embrace change that is needed and be ready to think and act. It is our hope that the 3 sessions of this seminar will showcase the innovations in the water sector that can facilitate synergies between mitigation and adaptation. In this, we will discuss how land use transformation, ecosystem restoration, and green infrastructure need to be designed in ways to reduce climate impacts while contributing to increased resilience and adaptation to change. Our speakers will put forward their views on which policy mechanisms, financial incentives, and new innovations that are required to foster synergy and avoid trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation. And we will discuss how this can contribute to achieving the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. In this, we see that the upcoming COP26 will be one litmus test of and insight. Therefore, I'm very honored and pleased to introduce to you our first speaker, who is Swedish Deputy Prime Minister and also our Environment and Climate Minister, Mr. Per Bolund. A biologist by education and with a long and well-recognized engagement and knowledge in environmental issues, Minister Bolund is well placed to give the opening speech to our seminar.
Dear colleagues, experts, and water friends, I'd like to start by thanking the conveners of this seminar for the opportunity to welcome all of you to a dialogue and knowledge exchange on these pressing issues. As the IPCC made unquestionably clear in their latest report, climate change and its effects on water are facts and global threats. The climate crisis affects the water cycle, causing both more extreme floods and more severe droughts. Now we must let the graveness of the situation give us the strength to accelerate our work and enhance the momentum. Remembering the words of the IPCC, the climate we experience in the future depends on our decisions now. We must be brave. I don't think it has escaped anyone that water plays a critical role in both mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. Both in the short and in the long term, climate changes affect our water. This has been made all too clear during the summer of extreme weather. Floods, as well as extreme heat leading to droughts and forest fires, show how vulnerable our societies already are to climate change. IPCC's report is clear about that climate change has increased the frequency of heat extremes and has also made them more intense around the world, both on land and in the oceans. Every increase in temperature increases the frequency of weather extremes with major effects on communities and on ecosystems. So, it is crucial that we work with climate change adaptation at the same time as we intensify our work with keeping future climate changes to a minimum. To strive towards a healthy climate and towards healthy water management, go hand in hand. For example, to be able to preserve biological diversity in the sea, an ambitious climate policy is crucially needed. At the same time, resilient and healthy seas contribute to the absorption of carbon dioxide and thus contribute to making other climate measures even more effective. Water, climate, biodiversity and sustainable development are intimately linked. Against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, we can without a doubt say that health belongs to that list. The ongoing pandemic crisis shows the significance of fulfilling the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. The health crisis and the environmental crisis are both direct and existential threats that spare no country around the world. So all countries need to enhance their ambitions. International cooperation is absolutely central in handling all of these urgent pressures, but also in contributing to security, sustainability, and welfare in the long term. The ongoing pandemic has further stressed the need for an equitable and safe access to water and sanitation, giving the importance that we now all know of washing hands to prevent the spread of the COVID-19 virus. Adding to the effects of climate change, the COVID-19 crisis highlights the urgent need for an improved and sustainable water management. Clean and safe water and sanitation is a prerequisite for life and human health. It is also a matter of gender equality. Women and girls around the globe face serious health risks due to inadequate access to safe drinking water and to sanitation facilities. It is vital that everyone have the same opportunities to access, use and manage water services and resources. Increased gender equality is therefore key for more effective and more sustainable water governance. Our world is facing great challenges. Despite the tragedies following from the ongoing pandemic, it has also highlighted our ability to adapt. We now know that our world has the capacity to change. We should use that to transform our way of living to one that is in line with reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. Actions on sustainable water management and reducing climate change need to be the backbone of the ongoing recovery from the pandemic. A green recovery from the pandemic by investing in water, in health, in biodiversity and climate is an investment in the future. It creates jobs, it improves fish production, blue carbon sequestration, erosion protection, etc. Early adaptation measures help society avoid more problematic, expensive and adverse effects on climate and water later. To avoid a climate catastrophe, emissions of greenhouse gases must be reduced to zero. Every step we take to reduce our emissions mitigates the negative impacts on societies and on ecosystems. It also strengthens the supply and the quality of water. Sweden's goal is to reach net zero emissions by 2045 at the latest, and to achieve negative emissions thereafter. At the European Union level, we have committed to climate neutrality by 2050. One important step towards that is the newly presented Fit for 55 package that will help the European Union reduce net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. As the United Nations Climate Conference, COP26, approaches, we must remember our promises made in the Paris Agreement. All countries must submit enhanced nationally determined contributions in line with what the latest science requires to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees. The Swedish government's objective for society's adaptation to climate change is to develop a long-term, sustainable and robust society that actively meets climate change by reducing vulnerabilities and taking advantage of opportunities. As a result of the increased frequency of water scarcity, as well as flooding, Also in Sweden, the Swedish government has made investments in the water area. For instance, nature-based solutions such as reconstruction of wetlands have been implemented. These measures not only improve water quality and biodiversity, but also help retain the water in the landscape and thus contribute to groundwater recharge. I would like to highlight a few priority actions that are imperative for adaptation to climate change. Firstly, mainstreaming climate resilience into all relevant policy fields. Secondly, to strengthen and further develop knowledge and information building. And lastly, the synergies between climate, biodiversity and water quality. We need to support and to promote the importance of nature-based solutions and other innovative solutions. Finally, let me add, as water is a cross-cutting issue, it is crucial to involve all relevant stakeholders to create understanding, ownership and participation. Local involvement is a prerequisite for finding new solutions and working methods. The distribution and quality of our water around the globe will be and are already changing. These undesirable effects will be even worse if we do not reach our ambitions on mitigation and on adaptation measures. Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 and fulfilling the promises of the Paris Agreement are crucial building blocks to navigate the multiple crises of our world that our world is facing. This direction must be the same across all sectors and organizations of our society. It is obvious that we need the courage and the strength to act now. I hope that you will have fruitful and productive discussions on these important topics. We all have important and complementary roles to play. Actors at the local, regional and global level, future and present policymakers, and grassroots organizations, civil society, scientists and CEOs, international organizations and committed individuals. We all need to join forces in building resilience faster. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Bolund. I'd now like to turn to UK Climate Champion for COP26, Mr. Nigel Topping.
Hello, and many thanks for the invitation to speak to you all today. As the UN Climate Champion for COP26 and as co-lead of the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action, my work serves as a linkage between national governments and the full spectrum of non-state actors on climate issues, including businesses, cities, provinces, indigenous peoples and civil society. And the Marrakesh Partnership works to mobilise actions on both climate mitigation and climate resilience. And the UK presidency is committed to making COP26 a breakthrough moment for global climate action, which will require action from those non-state actors as well as from the countries who are parties to the Paris Agreement. The recent IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, as well as widespread news of thousand-year floods in China, landscape-altering fires in Western North America, and severe heat and flooding in Europe in recent weeks, come as a call to accelerate and enhance our ambitions and our actions. Indeed, the IPCC makes a very strong case for water as a threat, but also as a tool for adaptation. The traditional Chinese saying says that water that keeps your boat floating can also sink you. And a traditional saying in Hawaii and Polynesia has the saying for dangerous rivers that water recognises no friend. So as host of this year's climate negotiations, the UK government has a strong commitment to both slowing and ultimately preventing dangerous climate change through ambitious climate mitigation, whilst also making adaptation and resilience a key priority. And achieving water security is clearly a win-win on both fronts. Now, today I'm here to talk a little about the nature-based solutions needed to rise high on our climate agenda if we're to build resilience and move to scale with our climate mitigation and adaptation agendas. As countries continue to accelerate efforts to mitigate the effects of a changing climate, adaptation actions remain indispensable to protect communities from the detrimental impacts of climate variability and change. While grey engineering solutions such as dikes or levees have been the most widely used measures to adapt to and reduce climate risks in the past, nature and its ecosystem services have increasingly come to the fore as an effective alternative or complementary solution. And while it takes more time for the full benefits of nature-based solutions to be reaped, they have been recognised for the multiple societal benefits that they can bring and the co-benefits that they offer. Riverbend or wetland restoration, for example, can reduce flood risk and contribute to enhancing biodiversity, while also providing sinks for carbon emissions. The cost efficiency and adaptability to climate change, as well as the multiple co-benefits for human health and well-being, have further added to their attractiveness. And in recognition of the effectiveness of nature-based solutions in addressing climate risks, a number of international efforts are promoting their use, including, of course, the Paris Agreement. And for countries to fully exploit the potential of nature-based solutions, more knowledge is needed on how to overcome some of the recognised challenges. Nature-based solutions still remain implemented on relatively small scales and on an ad hoc basis. And a lack of awareness and gaps in technical capacity continue to hinder application at a larger scale. However, we know that major obstacles persist, especially in demonstrating and quantifying the benefits and performance of nature-based solutions over time. Finance also is widely cited as one of the most persistent obstacles to scaling nature-based solutions. However, a coalition launched in 2016 and led by the Climate Bonds Initiative has found a way to overcome this obstacle. Together with their partners at AGWA, CDP, Ceres and WRI, they crowdsourced investor criteria for green bonds for water infrastructure resilience, including nature-based solutions. These criteria went live in 2018 and to date have been used on 6 continents for projects totaling well over $10 billion. And one of the largest certified bonds ever issued in Europe was a sovereign bond from the Kingdom of the Netherlands for nature-based flood control investments totaling over €5 billion in 2019. The bond was named the Room for the River bond. Another example came in 2020 when COVID-19 restricted shipments of grey construction equipment from Fiji. The government decided to move all in with nature-related solutions that enhance the country's disaster risk reduction, erosion and water supply and sanitation investments. They had the necessary materials already at hand. So projects such as the Dutch Room for the River bond and Fiji's green investments are not steps that are moving towards going to scale. They are going to scale. Similarly, both the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank have published new guidance on the links between green and hybrid infrastructure and how to align these solutions with traditional economic development challenges, especially for climate adaptation and mitigation. These are bold strokes. Water ecosystems are at the centre of how our economies and communities engage with the water cycle, the resource critical to health, sanitation, energy, agriculture and cities. Indeed, water, climate and ecosystems are all part of a single integrated system, and we need to manage, finance and create global and national climate policies that integrate the treatment of these systems as a whole. For national governments, this often means that we need to break ministerial and sectoral silos. The same forests that store and sequester carbon also store water in their soils and direct clean, high-quality water into our rivers and aquifers. Non-state groups are often better at seeing these connections than national governments. The process of evaluating and refreshing our nationally determined contributions should be a process of looking for these synergies in the communities and ecosystems that may not otherwise have clear voices if we do not listen and make space for them. If science and engineering can describe in technical terms the nature-based solutions we need for climate mitigation and adaptation, then civil society, including minority and First Nations groups, provide the vision of what good work must look like and the heart and inspiration that will carry these projects into new generations. COP26 is where national parties publicly express their climate ambitions through the nationally determined contributions. And these are new, and as policy instruments, they're still evolving. They don't describe projects often so much as outline priorities, which can then turn into projects from national ministries through cities, companies, and civil society. And in many cases, ensuring that NDCs create the enabling environment to scale nature-based solutions will depend on seeing the water hidden in climate priorities. It's exciting, therefore, to witness the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office working with groups such as the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation to create guides for state parties to see the water and the water ecosystem landscape embedded in their NDC priorities. Good example, Bolivia has already made powerful strides in this area in just the past few months by linking national and regional water priorities with national development and climate ambitions. Indonesia's whole-of-government approach to water resilience in its NDC, supported by groups such as Wetlands International, the Asian Development Bank and Deltares, has already spurred nature-based investment projects across the country, which is especially important given Indonesia's water-sensitive carbon reserves in forests and peatlands. Malawi, Egypt, Costa Rica and many other countries are all partners in this work. Now, resilient, water-sensitive, nature-based solutions for climate mitigation and adaptation are new to many institutions and national parties. This must change. Traditionally, we've defined climate change as an environmental problem, and we've often focused our attention on environmental NGOs and environmental ministries. Today, we know that climate change is both an existential and an economic problem, and our strategic resilience assets are contained in our natural capital, especially our water resources. Huge challenges remain, not least in the capacity and knowledge of how to link good projects with appropriate funding. But unlike just a few years ago, nature-based solutions that harness the power of water-related ecosystems are now viewed as approaches that can compete in terms of scale, cost and performance with grey investments. COP26 is a place to connect water and nature-based solutions, not just within national programmes, but also across international programmes, such as the Food Systems Summit and the Energy Summit. The race we are running should not be paved in concrete, but instead be rewilded, regenerated and restored. I'm delighted to see the work being done at the World Water Week, and I'm excited at the potential being tapped.
Thank you, Mr. Topping. I'd now like to turn to PhD candidate Amy Fallon.
Okay, hello, and thank you for joining to listen to my presentation. My name is Amy Fallon. I'm a PhD candidate at Aalto University in Finland in their Water and Development Research Group. And today I'll be presenting some of my work with my colleagues Ron Jones and Marco Keskinen on the idea of governance bouncing forward and how to bring resilience thinking into water governance. I'll begin straight away with a few key messages. So first, resilience has a lot to offer water governance studies and can help us to understand dynamic social hydrological systems in terms of complexity, non-linearity, cross-scale interactions and crises, and a lot more. But for this to be relevant to governance studies, we need a critical approach. And by this, I mean we need to really carefully consider the social elements that are often missing in resilience studies, especially in its understanding from ecology. And although this is slowly changing, but some of the pitfalls and assumptions are quite easy to make. So for example, we need to consider issues of politics, power and equity. And we need to understand that resilience isn't necessarily good or bad, it just depends on your perspective, which I will get into later. And this then means that we have to start asking these normative questions, such as resilience for whom. And later I'll show through a case study from Cambodia that big shifts in institutions, such as policy changes, don't necessarily build resilience. especially at the local level. There's a lot more at play within governance, and resilience thinking can help us think about governance as a process instead of only focusing on structure. And resilience isn't inherently a pro-poor concept, so we have to be careful not to depoliticize water issues, especially in a development context. I know we'll be talking about policy synergies in this session, but I also want to highlight that, at least in terms of resilience, because resilience of one scale or social group may come at the expense of another, trade-offs are inevitable. And higher level policies may contradict or undermine resilience efforts at the local level or affect different groups in different ways. So we can't just talk about resilience of a system or in general, we have to talk about different parts and different groups. And if we focus too much on short-term responses, we risk locking in marginalised groups, especially to cope with water-related risks, rather than acknowledging where the burden of resilience actually lies and the structural causes of vulnerability. And here, agency is essential. So is a person more resilient, for example, because they can migrate away from a hazardous environment, or are they less resilient because they were forced to do so? So their agency is a really important consideration here. And this brings me on to my third key message, which is that resilience isn't only about bouncing back or even adapting, but it's also about bouncing forward and transforming. And how do we do that in terms of governance? Well, understanding where rigidity traps lie within a governing system is a pretty good place to start. And I'll show that again with our case study later. For example, the historical development of institutions can lead to a lot of persistence in how things are done, meaning that just changing a policy may not be enough. And here, understanding behaviours and informal institutions, such as the social norms and cultural values that shape how we use and allocate and manage water resources, as well as the narratives and principles that we use, are really important when we're talking about transformation. And also for transformation, we need to think about all the different perspectives that exist and how to give everybody an equal say at the table. And here then we have to start asking those really difficult questions around justice and equity. So these are some of the considerations that I hope you take away in this presentation. For the study, we used a theoretical multiplicity approach to analyse the theories of social ecological systems, resilience, and interactive governance. And we looked at how each of those theories deal with things like social and environmental change, system dynamics, scale, complexity, as well as those more thorny problems such as power and politics and equity. And really thinking about what this means for governing these dynamic social hydrological systems. And I'm an environmental social scientist, so I also use a critical political ecology lens as my umbrella for these sorts of studies. So I'm mostly interested in the social and political aspects of environmental change, as well as how we can interrogate the concepts and ideas that we use in our studies as well, which is quite important when we're talking about resilience. And so from this we built a resilience governance framework, which is a theoretical framework, and then we applied it to a couple of case studies. Here I'll just talk about the one from Cambodia, and we used a qualitative case study design for this. And resilience, is it another buzzword? Well, it's being increasingly taken up by policymakers and non-government organisations, and often used in conjunction with concepts such as vulnerability and adaptation. And it has a lot of different interpretations and uses. It just depends on the discipline and perspective. But generally, as we see it, we define it as the capacity of a system to absorb and adapt to unexpected shocks and disturbances while maintaining its essential functions. And in water governance studies, in our field, we mostly use it as a normative goal, so things like building climate resilient infrastructure or building the resilience of local communities to climate change and these sorts of things. But actually resilience is more than those things. And because it struggles with problems such as the politics and power and social dynamics, if we can deal with those problems, then we can use it in a much more advanced way. And of course, we can't copy-paste resilience into governance analyses. We have to be careful, for example, not to depoliticize water issues. And also we have to be careful not to romanticize even local communities' adaptive capacity and resilience. And while I won't go into detail on governance itself because of time, I'll just highlight that governance and water governance is more than policy and the more formal institutional arrangements. It's also about informal practices, social norms and values, and maybe we can even understand it more as a phenomenon of how we manage, allocate and use water resources. And it's about the interactions between institutions and actors. And this is where resilience then helps us to not focus too much on logics of centralization and control and predictability, but try and steer governance towards looking at principles of reflexivity and adaptability and change. So we decided to use a relatively simple and commonly understood interpretation of resilience, as you can see here with this ball and cup figure. So resilience is basically a function of absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity, leading to either persistence or a system transitioning, or fundamentally changing because it's come over a tipping point or a threshold. And we also understand resilience not just as a system property, but as a process and an outcome. So we tried to combine all these different things. And we actually use the interactive governance framework as a basis for the governance aspect of the framework, because it already has these implicit linkages to social ecological systems and resilience theory. So as you can see in the figure, you have the governing system and the system to be governed, and the two interlink very strongly and kind of correlate with social systems and ecological systems. And importantly here, we can look at the governing system itself and start to think about the elements of resilience that appear in the governing system. And in terms of governance, then we can consider it as the day-to-day actions that take place, and also the formal and informal institutions. And then in this third order governance, we can look at things like the cultural values, social norms, principles and narratives that shape how we think about water. And we then linked that framing of water governance with resilience, as I mentioned before. So this figure just puts it all together. And ultimately, we're looking at how the system to be governed and the governing system each respond to different pressures and change, especially environmental change, and how they interact. And now I'll quickly turn to the case study that we tested the framework on, which is the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia, which is in the Mekong River Basin in Southeast Asia. And the lake is often called the beating heart of Cambodia because it has this really dynamic flood pulse system that changes seasonally and supports livelihoods such as fishing and agriculture. And it creates this synchronized livelihood pulse. So the two are very strongly linked. But the Tonle Sap is undergoing massive changes hydrologically, because the Mekong upstream, at least, there are a lot of hydropower dams being built, irrigation dams, climate change, and there's also a lot of demographic changes and outward migration of the lake. And all of these things are not only changing how people are using the lake and their livelihoods, but also increasing the unpredictability of water flows because of the dams and degrading fisheries. So there's a lot of different things going on in the system, and resilience thinking is quite useful when looking at it. And yeah, here's just a quick map, which I won't go into detail, but if you're interested in where it is. But our research group has also done a lot of work on the Mekong River Basin's water and food security issues, and especially in the Tonle Sap Lake. So if you're interested in this side of things, then I recommend that you check out our website. And here's a visualization then of that framework applied to the Tonle Sap Lake. And I won't go into lots of details on it, but I'll just highlight a few things. So generally speaking, the communities that live on the lake and depend on it for their livelihoods are really well adapted to living alongside the lake's seasonal fluctuations. So they're really dynamic, but they're predictable. But this doesn't mean that they have a high capacity to cope with unpredictable change, which is now occurring because of the weakening flood pulse that's going on. And this also differs between ethnic groups. And essentially, people at a local level are locked into coping with water-related risks on a short-term basis, rather than being able to think about the broader problems that are causing their vulnerability in the first place. So you have this system to be governed here at the bottom that's rapidly changing in terms of degrading fisheries, a weakening flood pulse, and increasing inequality. And now Cambodia's government did change the fisheries legislation quite abruptly several years ago to tackle this problem of overfishing, which they deemed to be the main issue. But it had limited impact on the ground for several reasons. So first, it was rapidly implemented and not really enforced or even maybe thought through. And second, it did little to address the root causes of degrading fisheries. And also, it didn't deal with contradictory policies such as the climate and energy policies at a national and regional level that were encouraging hydropower development as a climate mitigation tool. And also, this massive policy change didn't address local level power relations, and those actually dictate the day-to-day practices of fishing around the lake. And third, in the background, there are very persistent narratives and principles around water and the environment. So up here on the top left, you can see that this really strong absorptive capacity of narratives and the way that water is seen. And this includes this idea of a hydraulic society and a very long-standing historical ideologies that exist around water and irrigation. And they're deeply rooted in the country's history. So we have this combination of a highly persistent and increasingly authoritarian hierarchical government, which stifles innovation and is very inflexible and just maintains the status quo. But then you have this rapidly changing system of the lake, the system to be governed. So if you can see here on the bottom right, we actually then began to visualize this as those two spheres that we always talk about as linked, the social ecological system or the governing system and the system to be governed. But it's almost as if they're pulling away from each other. So you have this deepening persistence of the governance system, but the system to be governed, the hydrological system, is changing very quickly on different timescales. So we thought that was quite an interesting aspect of this case study. So what are we trying to make resilient and why? And is bouncing back enough? And so we're starting now to get into those deeper questions around resilience in terms of governance. So if bouncing back isn't desirable, then how do we bounce forward or transform in terms of governance? So first we can identify rigidity traps within a system, so where there's a lot of resistance to change, and also therefore where the windows of opportunity may be for really enacting transformative change. And then we can also start to ask these value-based questions around resilience. So what system functions do we want to preserve? You know, whose resilience are we talking about? What needs to change? And this is again where those trade-offs come into play. There are always winners and losers when it comes to resilience. And also transformation often has a significant price, at least socially and politically. So we also then need to think about those sorts of problems. So then what can we focus on? Well, we see that pluralism in governance interventions is really important, and this relates to that diversity element of resilience. And it ensures that many different perspectives are brought to the table and diverse groups work together. And also then helps us ask those value-based questions and steering away from the status quo and trying to imagine a different kind of future. And as we saw in the Tonle Sap case, that third order governance is really crucial for this. So how do we frame water problems in that context? What are the social norms and cultural values that shape how water is used? what are the day-to-day behaviours and actions, and also what's the historical context. You know, what is maintaining the system as it is in a good or a bad way. And finally, I'd argue that resilience thinking is very useful for focusing more on governance as a process instead of only looking at institutional structure. And this is really where the exciting stuff comes, I think, with resilience thinking. So back to our key messages then that I brought up at the beginning. Resilience thinking is useful for water governance studies if we can do it critically and avoid its general pitfalls and assumptions around social issues. Second, trade-offs are inevitable, but agency is essential. And resilience isn't just about bouncing back, but it's also about bouncing forward. And with that, I'll leave you with this quote that I really like about resilience, which is that resilience is great if you're being punched in the face, but it does nothing about the fact that you're being punched in the face. And with that, I thank you for listening. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. And if you want to discuss further, then here's my email address. Thank you.
Good day, I'm John Matthews, Executive Director for AGWA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. I have the potentially dubious honor of trying to summarize 4 great speakers in 5 minutes. What have we learned about how nature can knit together our climate mitigation and adaptation work going forward? I'd like to start with an observation I took from doctoral candidate Amy Fallon. In her work in Cambodia, she saw how climate impacts in the Mekong River revealed a profound and almost tragic gap and mistake being made by decision makers there. They think they're in charge. Instead, the social, ecological, and climate systems are reassembling the stage and actors, even rewriting the script, and mostly through the language of water. Making decisions in spite of, instead of with the flowing current of change, must be a great lesson for us all. And it's also a lesson that she sees can be corrected and fixed in Cambodia, which I think may be the most important takeaway. UK climate champion Nigel Topping makes a similar point but using somewhat different language. Climate change is an economic issue rather than a topic to be relegated only to environment ministries. As Swedish Minister Borland remarked, we need to align with shifting conditions and build new partnerships to solve new problems. Nature and nature-based solutions can both slow down climate change and build up new solutions. Mr. Borland's overriding message here is urgent, coordinated, and decisive policies and actions, of which he gave many examples. And our first speaker, my friend General Secretary Karin Lexian from the Swedish Nature Conservation Society, told us that we must both have faith and work hard, that sometimes surprising solutions to difficult challenges like climate change come in unusual packages, in the same way that solutions for coping with and moving beyond COVID-19 have emerged in surprising ways over the past 18 months. Nature and water, she advises us, will be at the center of these solutions. The title of this seminar is Navigating Multiple Crises. But after listening to these speakers, I wonder if we should have called this seminar Taking Advantage of Multiple Opportunities. Traditionally, we've taken big problems and broken them into little pieces so that we can then divide and conquer and solve those little problems. All of our speakers have remarked on the importance of systems thinking, resilience thinking, which tells me that climate change calls us to gather our problems and bind them together so that solutions can become synergies and move to scale, especially when they're large systemic problems like climate change. The German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, began in 2020 to call such an approach One Health, linking ecosystems, human health and well-being, and climate change into a common program. In AGWA, we strongly agree with this approach, and we call it deep resilience, which is a term that we use to describe actions such as we've seen over the past few years in the city of Udon Thani in Thailand, where the mayor saw how water and climate impacts were affecting the city's energy, disaster risk reduction, and local irrigation programs. He saw that these were not separate problems, and he decided to develop a common, interlocking, and layered set of solutions that brought all of them into a single framework. In the end, Udon Thani created a series of urban lakes to store water and carbon for clean energy, and farms, and to capture floodwaters away from homes and businesses. Lakes designed to be livable and beautiful, and to merge active, resilient ecosystems with an urban landscape of active, healthy people. Nature-based solutions will not solve all problems, but they will solve a lot more than we're making use of now. Today, I heard that if we can reframe many of our challenges, they become opportunities, and nature-based solutions look far more competitive, effective, and durable than we see with siloed short-term thinking. My hope, as a father, as a biologist and climate scientist, and as a global citizen, is that we can move quickly to scale with and through nature rather than in spite of her. Lastly, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their time and their eloquence, and thank you as our audience of patient colleagues. I also want to invite you to join the next two segments in the series for this seminar. This Thursday is session 2, where we're going to talk about facilitating innovation and transformation as we navigate multiple challenges. We'll close on Friday with session 3, where we're going to be looking at the water, energy, food, and ecology nexus. A diverse panel will chew over issues from all 3 sessions, joined by a group of youth representatives from all over the world. On behalf of myself and my organizing partners, SIWI, the Swedish Nature Conservation Society, and AGWA, thank you for your time, and we wish you well, successful work, and good health. I hope we can all meet in Stockholm in person next year.